Really made this huge impression on me and everybody who worked with her when we worked on Poison. She is this, it's a side of her that I think is less known from her filmmaking and maybe her public persona as an auteur, that she is also this incredibly funny, brilliant wit and acerbic observer of life. And and so she just, I just dug her, man. I just thought she was such an incredible person. And so it was the spark of the beginning of a friendship that would last all these years. But I didn't really know what she was working on and what she was doing beyond her having worked on that art department. It felt like, this is how I remember it, sort of turning around and all of a sudden she had made a feature film, River of Grass. And then I saw the film and I just will never forget thinking like, wow, keep your eye on this person because she's something else. River of Grass was an audacious debut, but it was also, I think, challenging just in the sense of practice. And I think being a woman director and trying to sort of corral the forces and energies of the sort of hierarchy of crews, male-dominated sort of sensibility even at this time, I think was hard and I think felt like a frustrating struggle at times for Kelly. And she also, I think, had other avenues to explore creatively that were more in experimental veins of filmmaking. And that's really where her attentions went to following River of Grass. And she started to make films more sort of by hand. And then I came to Portland where my sister had been living to get away from the city and write a script. And sort of fell in love with this weird, strange, unique, sort of untouched community of Portland, Oregon. And Kelly would visit me and get away from New York as well. So she started to meet these friends of mine that I had met. And one of them was John Raymond, who's a novelist and short story writer. So through meeting John and getting to know John's work, and one particular short story, Old Joy, that he had already written, Kelly and John started talking about adapting it into a feature. And so it all kind of started to unfold from these new relationships. And I felt something about what was happening in the Pacific Northwest at that time that just felt like a refreshing regional energy that wasn't as much interested in the kind of career definitions of success that one might find more in big cities like New York or LA. And I think I needed it myself at that time in my life, And I think Kelly very quickly appreciated something going on over here that made sense to her and felt liberating and felt like it could be a place of a kind of a revisioning of her own practice as an artist. And it's, of course, this relationship with John, this extremely smart, lovely, unique person who had a specific sensibility and sense of curiosity, I think made sense to Kelly's aesthetic, became the groundwork for these series of films that she would make for the next several years. Kelly had gotten to know John and how to work with John. And then she was starting to entertain the idea of working with a writer she didn't know at all, hadn't spent any real time with, but whose work spoke to her. And the short story form, I think, has always made a great deal of sense for the kind of features that Kelly makes. The room in them to pay attention to space, location, the individual in relationship to their environment, and these sort of impasses that they confront. And this is really true for another regional writer exploring the West and the sense of sort of alienation and fragmented existence and isolation that frequents these lives that she describes in her short stories made a lot of sense to Kelly. Of course, Kelly decided which of these stories to put together and conceive as a triptych. And I was around watching the evolution of the scripts for certain women, watching that very delicate process of how to make three stories cohere in a single film, but also have room to operate on their own and to resist the kind of narrative compulsion to draw too many internal links between them, which I think in some ways, deprives you of your own ability to draw connections and to think more, more largely about what these three women's lives have in common, because they are quite different. I really feel like the visual, rhythmic, temporal language, let alone the narrative sort of construction that unites these three stories very delicately, is so considered, so precise. And that goes down to every sort of frame that Kelly and her DP Chris compose that really compartmentalize these women into their lives and reveal the way they compartmentalize themselves as coping mechanisms, as ways of surviving isolation, loneliness, even though each of the three stories is really about a couple and a relationship in some critical point.
Thank you. Thanks. Have a good night.
In many ways, what's so delicate about it is that these lives are so fraught with just the sort of small crises of survival, of just getting through, that desire is rarely an option for them, or it's so kind of problematic, like the Laura Dern character who's having a liaison with James LeGros, who you later learn is the husband of Michelle Williams in the second story. It's definitely a relationship or a sexual liaison that is, from the very start, it's almost like the beginning of Psycho. You know that there's something polluted about it, something that is not going to last. It's broken up into these frames, compartmentalized through doorways or in reflections in mirrors. It's fragmented. It doesn't have a holistic or organic kind of existence. And so there's something already that the frame is telling you, before the characters even maybe know it, that there's something impermanent about this. I think there's something so interesting about how the men in certain women, most notably Jared Harris's character, Fuller, but also James LeGros, like that they have this sort of easier access to expressing their needs or their despair. And that there's the crisis of femininity, of being a woman, of carrying a certain kind of burden that men aren't really, they're sort of oblivious to, a sort of fundamental difference that we all too easily forget, or men do, that it's innate. And often it means these women have to kind of, create the rigid order that keeps everything in place, which is true for the Michelle story, and in some cases true for the Laura Dern story as well. And then Michelle Williams, in her attempt to maintain this kind of control, like that first image of Michelle Williams in the movie, that crazy warm-up suit that is so buttoned down. She's like she's so tightly wound, it's like she's gonna snap. The measured transgression of a cigarette, enjoyed way distant in the woods, and then the little small of her back zipper that she pulls out one stick of gum to wipe away the trace before she goes back in.
How'd you break your arm?
It's just my wrist. Riding an unbroken horse.
Breaking horses? Is that part of your job?
No. Just back home with my brothers. Now, when we were kids, my brothers and I, we'd sneak out and jump on any old horse we could find. No.
And Lily Gladstone's character, hearing just that little description of how she would break horses, and you get a little glimmer of a sense of kind of wildness and instinctive life that's not really evident anywhere in this movie, that we all have to kind of tame away in our lives, you know, to survive. These routines of maintenance that Lily has to oversee at the barn and taking care of the farm was the part of the movie Kelly kept long. She just loved watching the routines. You know, it's sort of like a Bressonian kind of love of just watching. It's really interesting in a lot of Kelly's films, just the physical routines of life. She really pays attention to the things that are usually omitted and overlooked and not considered in the way we live. That sense of observed detail is evident throughout the entirety of certain women in all of Kelly's movies. And I think she brings her actors into the process of these choices when relevant, like for clothes. Kristen Stewart was really attentive to the wardrobe that her character should wear. And the choices are so specific and so great, and you can't get that peach or beige sweater that Laura Dern is trying to tuck back into her skirt out of your head when you think back on the film, or obviously the location of the mall where the Native American kids are performing right next to the food court or something. It's such a feat of a real cinematic artist. And then there's that stunning moment, of course, in one of the most moving parts of the film where Lily is leaving Kristen Stewart after kind of taking the huge monumental risk of showing up in her world as a sort of testament of some interest or curiosity or desire, and is rebuffed and gets back in the car and drives away. And all of a sudden we hold for quite a while in this shot where you can barely breathe while watching it, because we all remember those moments where we've ventured past a certain boundary and felt completely traumatized by it. And then we have to sort of withdraw. And it's the only time there's music in the entire film. And it slowly rises up from this void. And then there's a cut to a static shot of a tree. And something about the difference between movement and stasis is shattering in this incredibly controlled and intentional, but very simple juxtaposition between two shots. So much about that crazy and simple, but sort of all-defining notion of movement and stasis, you know, that Kelly, as a filmmaker, is so in control of.